News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And a very good evening to you, and this is Newsline Live, but it's a recording. As you can probably guess, we are at the National Museum, courtesy the BBC and the National Museum. Today we have a very special guest on the program, a internationally acclaimed, award-winning journalist and a broadcaster with a huge portfolio. Nothing else to say other than, I think, introduce our guest. And we're absolutely delighted that our guest has agreed to be on the program. It's none other than Zeinab Badawi. Welcome to Newsline.
Thank you, Faraz. It's terrific to be with you. I mean, I have only just met you once before, but I feel like we're old friends.
Well, we're journalists. But thank you. And welcome to Sri Lanka. I believe this is your first trip to paradise.
It is.
Paradise.
It is, yes. It is indeed my first visit to Sri Lanka, but I'm sure it will not be my last. You know, I've been dying to come here for so many years, and I'm just so sorry it's taken me so long to come to this beautiful, beautiful island. And so far, I've not been disappointed at all.
Excellent. That's wonderful to hear, but sad because Sri Lanka has had many opportunities for journalists of your standing to come to this country, but we're nevertheless grateful that you have come.
I'm making up for lost time, by the way, Faraz.
Thank you. Zeinab, tell me, what brings you to Sri Lanka this time?
So I present a programme for the BBC called Global Questions, and also another one called Hard Talk. So I have come to give these programmes a bit of an airing here in Sri Lanka. And Global Questions, we're recording two programmes here on the grounds of the National Museum. The first one is about the economic global crisis and the particular impact it's had on Sri Lanka. And the second one is about climate change and the challenges for Sri Lanka and other countries that are beset by similar problems.
Excellent. Maybe it's appropriate to tell our audience, because you are so well known, and Hard Talk is very closely followed in Sri Lanka by everybody. And with the advent of the latest technology, you know, the world has got much closer. And in fact, the reduction in the digital divide has meant that Sri Lankans as a whole are very much more better informed, because obviously information is, just a bit away. So tell me, Zeinab, what made you enter this world of journalism?
I couldn't think of doing anything else. No, not really. You know, from about a very early age, I always harboured ambitions to become a doctor. There were lots of doctors in my family. Until I was about 16, that's what I thought I would do. And then I realised, first of all, I wasn't particularly good at the sciences, and then secondly, I couldn't stand the sight of blood. So I thought these were two major drawbacks.
Indeed.
So I studied politics and economics at university, and I thought to myself, you know what, I'm really interested in current affairs. And I think growing up in a family which was always very interested in what was happening out there, because my family are originally from the Sudan.
And then did you grow up in the Sudan?
No, I was born in the Sudan, but I moved to the UK when I was 2 years of age.
Right.
So I was always interested in foreign affairs and current affairs, and I guess what I did was combine that interest with my chosen profession, and that's what made me decide to go into journalism. And I also was keen to see if a diversity of voices could be brought to the British media.
It's interesting. But tell me, you know, for a person out of Africa and a woman, surely in those days, how did you manage to get yourself educated? Because I'm sure that back in the days, the education of a woman wouldn't have been given as much priority as a man.
Yeah, well, I come from a Muslim family, but I was very fortunate that my family were very enlightened. I'm one of 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. And I think that if you could say that female education is the family business, because my great-grandfather was the pioneer of women's education in the Sudan. So at the turn of the last century, he said to everybody, I don't see why my boys should be educated and not my daughters. So in the teeth of much opposition, he set up these schools. And so I grew up with grandmothers and great aunts who not only were educated, but some of them had, postgraduate degrees from Western universities. So we just took it for granted that we would all go to university. And so I think that was one major obstacle that really didn't exist for me. So I'm very grateful to my pioneering, visionary great-grandfather.
And obviously he started something that meant that the females were being empowered.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've never grown up with this idea that, Muslim women or women from Africa are these kind of downtrodden wretched.
They're not in the kitchen making chapatis and having 10 children.
Sometimes they are, but I mean, it doesn't mean that, the dynamics of power are much more subtle than that. And I think that, empowering women, education is very, very important.
But do you know to make chapatis?
Do I know too much about what?
Do you know how to make chapatis?
No, but I know how to eat them. And they're delicious. But I like your parati here in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
I went to a really nice Sri Lankan restaurant here in Colombo, which was just practically frequented only by Sri Lankans. And we had all just the traditional Sri Lankan food. And the parati was to die for. It was lovely and fluffy. I could have just carried on eating it all day.
Clearly you didn't.
And I could say something in return, but I won't.
But tell me, how, as an international journalist, and you've got this huge variety of programming, you've probably been to every corner of the world. Every corner of the world where there's been trouble. And unfortunately, trouble is news. How troubling has Sri Lanka been to you as a journalist?
So I've only been here in Colombo for a few days, but obviously I read a lot about what's going on in the country beforehand. And Sri Lanka is a bit of a cautionary tale for what can go wrong when it comes to managing the global economic crisis, which has obviously had an impact on just about everybody. But there are obviously questions of economic management which pertain particularly to Sri Lanka. I mean, the interesting thing is walking around Colombo and just looking around, I haven't been particularly struck by the fact that there is the worst economic crisis in this country since its independence. But it's there, and I wonder if it's going to appear perhaps down the line. I'm venturing out of Colombo, so I think it'll be interesting to explore what's going on outside the capital city. Capital cities are never really a very clear indication of what's going on in the hinterland.
Right.
Yeah.
You would have to move out of Colombo to actually catch hold of that. But do you see many similarities? People when our people started appearing on the streets, out of a variety of things, frustration and a deep sadness about the mismanagement of our economy and so on, coupled with the unfortunate COVID-19 pandemic and so on. But when I looked at it and I thought, I wonder if people are comparing it to the Arab Spring and so on. Do you see any similarities like that?
Well, I think that it's become fashionable to talk about street power and how protest movements can dislodge governments from power. And certainly that was the case in the Arab Spring, and it was the case here in July last year when the president resigned. And so there are similarities there. But I think the more challenging question is, what do you do after that? So obviously the millions of people who went out onto the streets did effect some change, but when and how that will have a material impact on people's cost of living crisis and standards of how they're getting their children educated and so on, I think that's still to be resolved. And I know that Sri Lanka is obviously in the throes of trying to renegotiate its debt and so on. So clearly the path ahead is strewn with a lot more obstacles.
Are you sort of surprised or amazed that democracy in this tiny island is robust?
I think that as far as I can see from the Sri Lankan people and the conversations I've had with them, I think they really are are fabulous, you know. They're really wonderful people, and I think that they are very resilient. I think they're renowned for being very patient, and I think these are very, very good qualities which will stand the country in good stead. Very hard working. I mean, you know, you have enjoyed some of the best living standards in the region, and that's quite apparent, you know, when you arrive here. But and I think that it seems that, you know, obviously the democratic institutions seem to have responded to those protests and actually brought about some change.
It's interesting that you talk about resilience. You obviously have had a lot of resilience, and I'd like to ask you, as a woman of colour in the media in Britain, in what was probably at the time a white-dominated industry, how did you make it through this abyss of whatever? And let's call it an abyss of difficulty. How did you make it? What were the challenges?
I suppose I've always been a very determined person, and I think that you know, sheer grit. You do. It's true. You do, as a woman and a woman of colour, have to try much harder, work much harder, But I think I was fortunate for two reasons. I went to a very good university in the UK, and I think that helped me a lot to...
How important was that, the choice of that famous university?
So, I mean, I was at Oxford University, and at the time that I went, there were very few women there. I think 1 in 4 of the students were women.
Let alone
a woman of colour. So I think that there was a strong Oxbridge bias, you know, back in the 80s when I started working, and I think I was the beneficiary of that. But also, to be fair to the UK, there was an awakening about the fact that they needed to have more diverse workforces, and the media is, you know, a window on what a country is like, and I think I benefited from that. So I think I was just in the right place at the right time.
Really? Let's find out. We're at the right place at the right time for a short break in which we look at this evening's headline from the wonderful primetime news team at News First. We'll see you on the other side of the break, shall we?
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. It's a recording from the National Museum where our guest tonight is Miss Zeinab Badawi, the internationally known broadcaster and journalist, and soon-to-be author, probably award-winning too.
I hope so.
What is this book? I know you did this 8-part series about news and so on. Is this a book about that?
So actually, it was a 20-part.
Oh, I do beg your
Start
pardon.
that again. Do you want to start that again?
No. That's all
Okay.
right.
Sorry. It's a 20-part TV series I made for the BBC about the history of Africa.
Right.
And I travelled over the continent, went to more than 30 countries over a period of 7 years. And the main kind of point of this project was to allow the Africans themselves to tell their own history. Because, you know, African history has been so denigrated or written by outsiders, or they've been told they don't have any. So I wanted to just give the African historian and intellectual a bit of a public stage. So I interviewed so many of them. And I just had so many good voices. I couldn't do justice to them in the TV series, so I thought, let me use them as an inspiration to write a book about the history of Africa from the beginning of time to the modern era. And that's what my book is about.
And when is it out?
Early next year.
Oh.
So I've got to get writing.
Okay, good,
Yeah.
good. Geraldine, is she going to be getting the whip out?
Yeah,
Make
well,
sure?
it's being published by Penguin Random House, and I think they're going to be cracking the whip very soon indeed. So I don't want to endure too many lashes, so I really must try and keep
Sri Lanka
up with
will
it.
be looking out for this book
I
by
hope so.
Zeinab Badawi.
I hope
But of course,
so.
you are a writer too. You have columns in the financial press?
Yes, I do. I write for newspapers sometimes, and I write, of course, on radio. And
Which do you enjoy the
my
most,
scripts.
Zeinab?
So I think the best part of my work for me is meeting people,
Right.
including people like you, Faraz.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so I think that,
Take note, you guys at Newsfirst.
yeah, renew his contract. I think that that has been the greatest privilege, really, of my very long career, because, you know, being a journalist gives you access to people. And I'm not just talking about the presidents and the prime ministers, but just, you know, the real engines of society, ordinary people. So that's been the best part of my job. And trying to relay their stories as well. But I do enjoy writing, and it presents different challenges from television. So maybe I'll be moving more into that direction as I get older and start thinking about hanging up the microphone.
Tell me, you know, meeting people and broadcasting, tell me about Hard Talk. It's probably one of these most enduring programs the world over. How interesting has Hard Talk been for you?
Yeah, you know, I have been doing, this year it would have been 20 years since I've been presenting Hard Talk, and it's a very interesting program to do. It's the longest format interview program in the entire BBC firmament. It's interesting because it's interesting to see who actually submits themselves to that kind of, you know, sustained questioning. And I think the mere fact of appearing on Hard Talk is a sign that that person is quite committed to transparency in a way, because we never tell them what questions are being asked in advance, maybe just the areas, you know, the subject that we're going to be covering. And it's a difficult program to do, because you're sitting like this with somebody and you know that the person sitting opposite you will always know more about the subject than you do. Yeah. But it doesn't hold me back. I mean, you know, I've interviewed people like Amartya Sen, the Indian Nobel Prize winning economist, and I had to tackle him about economics in India and China because he was talking about that. He'd just written a book about, you know, a comparison of the two. So it can be quite challenging in that way, but I enjoy it, particularly if you have a guest who you can hold to account.
And of all of these, which, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, of all of these, which of these Hard Talks have been the most memorable for you?
Let me think. I have been asked that question lots of times. Yeah. But I would say...
If you've been paid a penny for each?
Yeah, I should have been paid a penny for each. I'd be definitely a penny millionaire. I think that, you know, so I would choose the Dalai Lama as one of my top standouts. I mean, I know there are many forms of Buddhism and so on. There are lots of Buddhists in Sri Lanka, of course. And why did I like him? It's just... First of all, you know, he's got such charisma and such charm. And in fact, when I went in to interview him, there was such a long queue snaking around the building of people waiting to see him. But what I liked about him was, you know, he takes what he does seriously, but doesn't take himself seriously. He has a terrific sense of humour, and actually was quite difficult to interview because he is quite disarming. He laughs a lot. And Desmond Tutu, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, was also somebody who was a standout for me. I remember saying to him that the then President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, I said to him, Archbishop, he has described you as an evil, little, nasty, interfering bishop. And he looked at me. And then he started laughing and his shoulders were shaking up and down. And so, of course, I just laughed. That's the one and only time I've laughed on Hard Talk, which goes against the spirit of the programme. But yeah, so I like them very much.
And do you think Britain itself is changing? We have a woman of colour, one of the BBC's prime broadcasters. We have a Prime Minister who's also of some colour. Absolutely.
Do you know, I think that there's a lot of talk globally, you know, especially in the light of the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, in the, you know, light of the killing of George Floyd, and a lot of soul searching took place about just how inclusive societies were. But I think that regardless of party affiliation, it is remarkable that this country that stood at the top of an empire now has a Prime Minister of Indian origin, and India, of course, was the jewel in the crown of the empire. And not only Rishi Sunak, but also a good number of men and women of colour in his cabinet. So I think that, just in terms of the symbolism, again, as I said, party politics aside, it doesn't matter if you're a Conservative supporter or not, this is remarkable progress.
Thank you. And before I finish, of course, I'd like to ask you, it's not all work, is it? What kind of music do you listen to?
Oh, I like Motown. I like to dance to Motown.
Really?
But I love listening to opera, and this is where I'm very lucky that the BBC indulge me and allow me to make films about opera, and it's called Take Me to the Opera. And so I just, I'll tell you a secret. I would pay the BBC to do these programs, so I'm very lucky that I'm actually, allowed to do them, and I'm paid for the pleasure.
I'm desperately hoping that the group director of this company is listening to this thing, because I'd like to do something like that, but not opera. But tell me, what about family? How many children do you have?
So I've got 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and they're all in their 20s. The youngest is 22, and they are.
Are they inspired by mum to be journalists?
None of them has gone into journalism. I'm not sure any of them will. Perhaps I put them off, I don't know. But no, they're all forging their own paths, really.
Was it difficult, combining being mum and journalist, broadcaster?
Look, it's difficult, I think, for any working mother to combine the demands of motherhood with bringing up children. But I was fortunate that I was able to have some help, and not all women are so fortunate. But you're like a juggler. You've got lots of balls flying up in the air, and you just carry on juggling and hope one of them doesn't hit the ground.
And do you get much time with the family?
Now actually I have to kind of negotiate with them to spend time with me, because they're too busy doing their own things. Not all of them live in the UK. But yes, I've always, when I did trips like this for the BBC, I was always very well known for being last in, first out. And so I, really just tried to keep the travel down to a bare minimum. And I really didn't start traveling until they were older. Before that, I was more studio based, a bit like you, doing programs in the studio. So I would say that's how I managed it. I was lucky that I had a career that enabled me to be studio based when it was necessary.
Well, I'm so glad that you came to Sri Lanka, because it gave me an opportunity to come out the studio and enjoy this.
Sit in this beautiful greenery, yes. And I look forward to seeing you on television. I should watch while I'm here, Faraz.
Please do. Thank you. But finally, before I leave you, Zeinab Badawi, and thank you on behalf of our group and all our viewers who will be watching this, thank you for being on this program. But finally, are you going to be spending a little bit more time on Paradise before you go back?
Absolutely. I'm determined to see, this beautiful island, this beautiful tropical island. So I'm going to be travelling in a couple of days' time, and I'm hoping to see the cultural sites at Sigiriya and take in as much as I can. But it sounds like I'll need a helicopter or whatever to get around. So what I can't do on this trip, I'll have to come back and try and see the other things.
Indeed, because the people of Sri Lanka are a resilient lot, and we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of reconciliation, and we need a lot of encouragement from the international community. We need people to come to our country because the Sri Lankans know how to look after you.
Well, it absolutely. Just looking at Colombo and the hospitality and the charm and grace with which everybody I've encountered has given us is really absolutely marvellous. So I would say, yes, it looks like Sri Lanka is back open for the tourists, and I hope that they'll flock in their numbers and that they will help keep you all buoyant.
Zeinab Badawi, unfortunately we've run out of time, but thank you ever so much for being on this program.
It's been terrific to be with you, Faraz, and your audience. Thank you so much indeed for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's the way it was on Newsline Live from the National Museum in Colombo with Zeinab Badawi. Thank you, take care. It's now time for the primetime news. And as always, God bless you all.